John F. Kennedy spoke about us landing on the moon in 10 years. Exactly. And we were little kids at the time, but even so, being Kennedy Democrats from Massachusetts, which we were, we found this very inspirational. I would love to see us put a 10-year effort into solving as many of those 300,000 cases as we could, much like the moonshot. And other lofty goals, but worthwhile goals. Because if you think about it, you mentioned this a moment ago, the family members of those 300,000 victims, let's just say on average, there's 4 people in each family. That means every single night, over 1 million people are struggling to get to sleep, wondering if their family member's case is ever going to be solved. And by the way, I know people get very process oriented. I'm not expecting all those people to be brought to justice, the bad guys, if you will. We're at 38 years now in the Colonial Parkway murders. We're fully cognizant of the fact that it's quite possible that Alan Wade Wilmer or other suspects may be involved in the Colonial Parkway murders, and they may never see justice per se, but answers are incredibly important. And I've actually tried to convey this to our FBI agents and Virginia State Police investigators, that answers are of great comfort to families who have been seeking answers, in our case, for decades. And so it isn't just a matter of putting bad guys in jail or charging people. It's about telling people what happened. I want to know why someone killed my sister Cathy and her girlfriend Rebecca Dowski in October 1986 on the Colonial Parkway. I'm not expecting people to go to jail at the 38-year mark. That's probably not a realistic goal, but I think answers are a reasonable thing to ask for.
That's Bill Thomas, the brother of Colonial Parkway's murder victim Cathy Thomas, a victim's advocate and the host of the Mind Over Murder podcast. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Bill Thomas is a victim's advocate, the host of the Mind Over Murder podcast, and the brother of Kathleen Marion Thomas, a 27-year-old United States Naval Academy graduate who's believed to have been one of the first victims of a string of murders on the Lower Peninsula of Virginia known as the Colonial Parkway murders. The murders mostly involve couples who were killed together on or off the Parkway between 1986 and 1989. Kathleen, who went by Cathy and who was working as a stockbroker at the time, was last seen leaving a computer lab at the College of William and Mary on the evening of October 9, 1986. She was with 21-year-old Rebecca Ann Dowski, a business management major at the college who went by Becky. On October 12, somewhere around 5:30 a.m., a jogger noticed a white 1980 Honda Civic sedan down an embankment on the Cheatham Annex Overlook just off the Colonial Parkway. The small pull-off is about 7 miles from Williamsburg and a place where visitors could watch birds like shorebirds and gulls in the water and in the woods. The vehicle was reported to be off the road and in a thick, dense area of shrubbery, only a few feet from a 15-foot drop into the York River. Both women had been strangled. Their throats were cut. The cause of death for all the victims ranged from a gunshot to stabbing to strangulation, but investigators found the similarities outweighed the differences in these crimes. Each involved a young couple sitting in a car. In each case, there were no signs of sexual assault or anything missing. In each case, the killer drove the car after the murders. It would be the first of 4 double homicides with 8 victims, on or near the 22-mile road operated by the National Park Service that connects Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown. After 36 years, in January 2024, in a case that's been mired by jurisdictional issues between the agencies involved, law enforcement announced that one of the cases, the deaths of 14-year-old Robin Edwards and 20-year-old David Knobling, were linked together through DNA to a local fisherman, Alan Wilmer Sr. Bill is now a nationally recognized advocate for victims of violent crime and leads the efforts of 8 families in the Colonial Parkway murders to find justice for their loved ones. Along with his podcasting partner, Kristen Dilley, the co-host and producer of Mind Over Murder, Bill explores an assortment of true crime cases that happen all over the country. He was the consulting producer on the Lover's Lane Murders true crime series for the Oxygen Network, and he's spoken at a wide variety of conferences, from CrimeCon to South by Southwest. Based in Norwalk, Connecticut, Bill has represented artists in film and television for more than 30 years and is the past chair of Film LA, the director of public affairs and chief of staff for a music licensing company, and has held several other titles in organizations in the music, film, and television industries. He's a graduate of the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he studied communications. Bill holds a somewhat unique place in the true crime space, where he is an advocate, a family member of a victim, and a successful true crime content creator. Tensions between creators and victims' families and advocates have heightened in recent years, and his approach of blending them provides a unique perspective. Today, we're going to discuss the ongoing Colonial Parkway's murder investigation, the true crime community and the media landscape, and how listeners, viewers, creators, law enforcement, family members, and advocates can, together, make a difference. So, Bill, I wanted to thank you for coming on the podcast. And I wanted to also just share with you a little bit about how I first heard about you. It was back in October, I think early October of 2023. And 2023 CrimeCon had happened in Orlando, I think. And one of my friends who had attended reached out and said, "You have to meet this guy, Bill Thomas." And I was like, yeah, whatever. And she was like, her name's Carly Fulham, and she's an avid listener of a number of podcasts. But she said, "You have to listen to him. He is the brother of somebody related to the Colonial Parkway murders," which sort of connects to my experience because my mom grew up on the Northern Neck in Lancaster County in Virginia.
Small world.
But she said that you were so, one, kind, and so insightful and brought a different perspective as somebody who was a successful podcaster in the true crime space, the family member of a victim, and an advocate, not just in words, but literal action on the case. So again, we come around to CrimeCon 2024. And once again, she says to me, before CrimeCon 24, "You really have to meet this guy, Bill Thomas." So I set as a goal within the next few months, I'm going to reach out to Bill Thomas and have a conversation about some of these issues. So I'm really honored to have you on.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. I'm very excited. It's not my favorite topic, but it's really wonderful to take the time to talk with you. And then, of course, once I was just glancing at your website and more about the podcast, I'm like, oh my gosh, I've been reading this guy for years in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and elsewhere. And it's great. It's great to talk with you.
Oh, well, thank you very much. One of the things that I hadn't really thought about as we were walking into this episode, so many times when we go into conversations about things like victims of crime, we often focus on the suspect or focus on the crime. But I wanted to start off just asking a little bit about what Cathy was like. Um, you know, I think it's really easy, I think, because we do want justice to focus on those things like the crime itself. And sometimes we forget that there was this whole interesting person that existed before the crime.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a really good point. And at the risk of sounding like every big brother who's ever bragged on his sister, if you met Cathy Thomas, you'd understand why this is so important to so many of us. Cathy Thomas is the youngest of four kids in our family. We're an Irish Catholic family from Lowell, Massachusetts, up north of Boston. And my dad had attended the Naval Academy, the United States Naval Academy, and graduated in the class of 53. And so we were Navy brats and moved all over the country. My mom was a nurse. And there are four kids in my family, three boys, and then Cathy, the youngest. And my dad didn't push us to only consider the military, far from it. As a matter of fact, I remember him saying you could do wonderful things in the civilian sector. You don't need to follow in my footsteps. But interestingly, of the four kids in my family, two of the four went to the Naval Academy and graduated. My older brother, Richard, who was now retired, he was a Navy doctor. He graduated from Annapolis in 1975. And then our younger sister, Cathy, announced while she was in high school one night at the dinner table that she was interested in attending the academy, which was a new thing back then. So Cathy is in the second class with women at the United States Naval Academy. So that makes my father, Joe Thomas, older brother, Richard Thomas, and youngest sister, Cathy Thomas. At that time, they were the first father, son, daughter graduates of Annapolis. Now, it's happened a bunch of times since, but they were the first.
Oh,
and
that's neat.
Cathy was an amazing person. Cathy surprised us with that announcement. There was a lot of concern, even trepidation in my family about Cathy attending the Naval Academy because we knew it was going to be a rough ride. It actually ended up being a much worse ride than we ever anticipated because Annapolis, the Naval Academy, wasn't really ready for women. Congress had decided in 1976 to open up all the service academies to women, but they really weren't set up for it. And there were a number of people high up in the United States Navy and at the Naval Academy that were completely opposed to these women attending the academy. But Cathy Thomas is one of those people that you meet every once in a while who will outwork anyone you've ever met. The reason Cathy succeeded in so many different things is because she worked harder than anyone you've ever met. So it didn't matter whether it was academics or athletics, whatever it was, she was going to work and work and work and excel because she pushed herself so hard. At the same time, she was a fun person, a joyful person. And I remember we heard stories from friends of hers from the Naval Academy when things got really pretty bleak and the level of harassment from the upperclassmen who really actually run the Naval Academy. It's a military structure, but the upperclassmen are actually very much in charge. And remember, those men, to be fair to them, had entered under a single sex arrangement, which had been that way for hundreds of years. And now they're being forced to accept these young women from around the country as joining them at the Naval Academy. And so the level of harassment and just general horrific behavior by midshipmen towards these young women was completely off the charts. This was not the United States Navy's finest hour. But at the same time, Cathy's classmates, and I remember we heard this after Cathy passed away too, that Cathy was one of those people that just, she just worked it, and just her determination to succeed and excel was so, it just grounded who she was. And she had this expression that she used to say to her fellow classmates, but in particular the women who went through a real rough time. She'd say, "Suck it up, buttercup." And she just found joy in often dark and difficult situations. And she did incredibly well at the Naval Academy, and then did 5 years in the Navy. Um,
It's interesting to me when I think of people like that, because we're in a day and age where, you know, minorities like African Americans or women can walk into almost any room, right? We're not completely perfect, but I remember early in my reporting career when Shannon Faulkner first attended the Citadel after following the lawsuit that allowed.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, or you think of somebody like Ruby Bridges being escorted by the marshals to
Mm-hmm.
her elementary school, and it, for me, I think, it's easy to look at those events like, oh, society had changed, but I think it's hard for people to understand that people like your sister Shannon Faulkner, exactly like you were saying, are knowingly walking into environments where change has been imposed on the organization, and not everyone is going to be there to make your life easy. It sounds like, I mean, it must take a lot of courage.
I would think so. And I'd like to think that I would have that level of courage, but I haven't been asked to be in that position. But I have nothing but respect for Cathy and her female classmates. And so she is in the second class with women at the Naval Academy. But then, of course, she graduates in 1981 and then heads out into the fleet, where things, quite frankly, weren't all that much better.
Right.
And on top of everything else, several years into her 5-year Navy career, Cathy's name comes up in an investigation of women who were lesbian. And for whatever reason, the Navy in particular was incredibly unwelcoming to gay and lesbian people, but especially lesbians, especially women. I mean, the idea that there might be a gay guy in the United States military can't be a shock to anyone, I would think. But the idea that there were gay women among the ranks, and these women were incredibly hardworking and unbelievably patriotic. I have nothing but respect for them. Cathy's friends among them. But it made for an extremely difficult time, which ultimately led to Cathy choosing to leave the Navy once she'd met her service obligation, which is 5 years. You go to a service academy, you graduate, you owe them 5. And she was investigated by the Naval Criminal Investigative Service in an unbelievably in-depth investigation. We found out about this after her death.
And isn't it crazy to think of that idea of someone digging into your personal life? I remember reading that book. I think Randy Schultz, who had written And the Band Plays On about the AIDS crisis, he followed it up with a book called Conduct Unbecoming.
I'm so glad you mentioned it, because I mention Conduct Unbecoming frequently.
Yeah, it is a powerful, powerful book.
There's an entire chapter in Conduct Unbecoming, and sadly we lost Randy Schultz due to the AIDS crisis later. There's an entire chapter in there, if you go back and reread it. It's an amazing book that's all about the Naval Academy and the harassment of those women, both gay and straight, at the Academy. Interestingly, the FBI actually asked me, probably, my partner Pamela teases me about this. I'll say something was 2 years ago, and she'll say, Bill, that was 7 years ago.
A decade ago.
Yeah, I'm sort of compressing the time. But it's got to be 5 or 6 years ago at least. Our FBI agent actually asked me to reach out to some of Cathy's classmates because they actually had a lead on a potential tie-in between Cathy's naval service and her murder in 1986, together with her girlfriend, Rebecca Dowski. So I ended up talking to about 15 different classmates of Cathy's. And I even talked to some of the women from the class of 1980, which is the first class of women.
Mm.
And this was really striking. I would say of the, about 15 women I spoke to, and I heard some great stories and some stories that made me smile. But at the same time, this I thought was really frightening. I would say 2/3 of the women that I spoke to who were gay and straight, but they were investigated by the Naval Criminal Investigative Service and accused of being lesbians, even though, like, one of them said to me, Bill, this happened when I was a freshman. They call them a plebe at the Naval Academy. We were 17-year-old virgins from around the country being brought in and interrogated by these NCIS agents and accused of being lesbian. We literally they were using sexually explicit terms. We literally didn't even know what they were talking about. We didn't even know what the terms meant.
And I think some of the attitude at the time was, why else would you want to go in the military if you weren't a lesbian? Which I do not entirely get, because I think if you really think about that thinking really hard, it
Yeah.
would apply to all sorts of other things, including men as well. But to walk into that environment, to stick it through her commitment, it probably says a lot about her, because I'm not sure even I could kind of walk through that kind of fire. Or, like you said, you may not be able to. And I'm not surprised that they wanted to investigate a Navy connection, given how Norfolk, Hampton Roads is such a large Navy presence. Which it kind of brings me to, sort of like the case itself. What was Cathy doing in the 80s during that time, and how did you find it? Were you in touch with her, and
Oh,
how
sure.
did you find out what happened?
Well, Cathy made the decision after she was investigated by the NCIS and she was interrogated by the NCIS. She was accused of being a lesbian. She, like she handled everything else, she just decided she was going to hunker down, get her work done, and just focus on work and going to the gym, full stop. She set herself a goal. This happened in 1984. Her service obligation would have taken her to June 1986. So she set herself a goal. She was very saddened by this decision, her decision, that she was going to get to 5 years and leave the Navy because she didn't feel like she could live her life as a lesbian in the United States Navy at that point. So she broke up with her girlfriend, who was had just gotten out of the Navy, and, as I said, just focused on doing an outstanding job and getting to 5 years. And she confided in my younger brother, Jack, who was also gay. So 4 kids in my family: older brother, Richard, then Bill, that's me, younger brother, Jack, Cathy, the youngest. And Jack and Cathy are a year and 2 weeks apart. So they're almost Irish twins. They're super close. And then I don't know how this all works, but both Cathy and Jack were gay. And so Cathy confided in him about her horrific realization that she'd been investigated by the NCIS, but she decided she was going to get to 5 years. So she did successfully get to the end of her 5-year commitment. She left the Navy and she was in grad school working on her master's degree and working as a stockbroker. And of course, like everything else in Cathy Thomas's life, she worked her butt off and was a very successful stockbroker, which again didn't surprise. So she was out of the Navy by that point. And that was, I think, a pretty significant relief for her. And as I said, she'd broken up with her Navy girlfriend. And then that spring of 86, she started dating Rebecca Dowski, Becky, who was a senior at William and Mary. They'd been introduced by, wait for it, Cathy's ex-girlfriend. I don't know how I don't know how this all works in the lesbian community, but it's all very, very close even after the breakups. It's I don't think I have a good relationship with a lot of women that I've been involved with over the years, but I couldn't say 100% of the time. And
you don't really imagine your former partner introducing you to your future partner?
Exactly. So Cathy started seeing Becky that spring of 86 and got out of the Navy in June 1986. And this would have been Cathy's second relationship with a woman, because she dated a former shipmate for several years before their breakup. And this would have been Rebecca Dowski, Becky's first relationship with a woman that we're aware of. But it was an exciting time, I think, for Cathy. She got out of the Navy in June 1986. And unfortunately, they ended up being murdered in October 1986. We never met Becky. We heard a lot about her from Cathy. And, this is a pre-internet environment. So it's phone calls and letters. Cathy was a big letter writer, and postcards. And we were really excited about Becky because the relationship sounded great and Cathy was out of the Navy. And so some of that pressure was off. The relationship seemed very, very happy. And sadly, we were supposed to meet Becky at Thanksgiving 1986. She was going to come up to my parents' house. And, we were all really excited. And they died just a few weeks before that in mid-October 1986.
Oh, man. That, at least you guys had what she shared with you, but that must have been, I didn't even think of the timing. She was murdered in October. It's right before the holidays. It's a time where you're sort of looking forward to being together and with people. Did you guys feel like you were robbed?
In many ways we did. And then I remember that first year, which is just like a living hell, the pain of losing Cathy. And then this very bizarre investigation begins to unfold. They're trying to figure out, and remember, the rest of the so-called Colonial Parkway murders haven't happened at this point. But we were very excited because the FBI was involved. And at the same time, we're going through this terrible grind of everything was the first time since
first
Cathy
Thanksgiving,
time.
the first Christmas, the first
birthday.
Yeah.
First New Year's, first Valentine's Day, everything. It was just like this terrible ticking of a clock as we marked each one of these holidays and major events. And, then you get to the following spring.
And then the last of the first, the anniversary.
Yeah. And so, my podcast partner, Kristen Dilley, asked me the other day, we just went past mid-October a couple of weeks ago, and she asked me, how are you doing? And I said, it's hard. Every year it's hard. And, for us now, it's 38 years. The single most painful thing about the entire experience, Jason, was seeing your own pain reflected in your family's eyes.
Yeah.
And, my parents were beyond devastated. My mother was literally never the same. In one evening, my mom, Evelyn, lost her youngest child, her only daughter, and her best friend.
Oh, wow. Wow. That must have been so hard for her.
She never recovered.
Wow.
It was,
and there's also, because I think, people think about things like losing their parents, we have the opportunity to prepare for it. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure there are some people out there who think about losing their kids, but I think the vast majority of us never feel that's going to happen.
Right.
And on one level, it must be devastating. I remember reading about murder victim and Maryland Heyman Lee's mother saying,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, that, when a child, I think it was something along the lines of when a child dies, you're buried with them.
Right.
And I can't imagine, but also I can't imagine siblings because, your siblings are the only people, only people in your life, as special as your parents are, and your parents are enormously special. The only people in your life who walk the world with you at what
Mm-hmm.
I like to call the same height, right? You have the same experiences, the same lenses, the same friends. There must be something really hard to lose your sibling.
Yeah. I know for my parents, both of them were completely devastated. I think the person that struggled the most was my mom, for all the reasons I just outlined. Plus, my father was still working full time. He was a college professor and then a dean up at the what was then called the University of Lowell, which is now called the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, uh, outside of Boston. And for my older brother Richard, myself, and my younger brother Jack, we were all working full time in very demanding jobs. So after Cathy died, and after a week or so of being together up in Lowell, we all went back to work. And in a way, that was a real relief because you're able to focus on something positive, your work,
Mm-hmm.
and you're working with people that have not suffered the same loss that you have, not to that same degree. Um, and so you're kind of surrounded by people that help balance you out. Whereas my mom, she was at home full time, and I remember hearing from my younger brother, Jack, saying, I'm really, really concerned about mom. She'd be up there in my sister's old room every day. It was excruciatingly painful. And it never really gets all that much better. I know people talk to me about closure, and I try to be polite and respectful, but I have no belief in closure.
Mm.
It just doesn't work for me. And of course, we've been looking for answers for 38 years. So this has turned into a protracted process.
Yeah, because the idea of sort of like closure is sort of predicated on this notion of being made whole and a
Mm-hmm.
door being ended. And there's no way, whether someone is arrested or whether they're convicted or whatever happens to them, that you ever get your loved one back, which was really what would make you whole. I guess all you can really hope for is justice.
Right. And for the most part, we have had one solved now in the Colonial Parkway murders last January 2024, and we can get into more detail. But it, there's no justice. I mean, it just. I'm not a cynical person. I hope some positivity comes through in our conversation today, Jason. But I can't assure anyone that they're ever going to feel any sense of completeness or justice, or dare I say closure. That just doesn't happen. It just becomes like this gaping wound in your life that is never healed.
Well, let me ask a question. Earlier this year, sort of jumping ahead, there was progress in the case. Wilmer was identified as a as the likely perpetrator of two of the murders and one other murder that hadn't been associated. Did it get better? What did it feel like?
Well, the 8 Colonial Parkway murders families, we've all worked together pretty closely in the last I got involved in the case in a more serious way in 2009, after the FBI lost control of 78 highly graphic crime scene photos. And that broke in the Virginia media, and that's what drew me back into the case. But we've always said, the 8 families, that any advancement, any solution, any solve for one of us would be a victory for all of us. So we took great joy in seeing a solve related to DNA in the Robin Edwards David Knobling case. Then, of course, it took this odd turn in that Teresa Howell, who was a name we were not familiar with, she was murdered in 1989. They were murdered in 1987. There was this linkage created there. It probably won't surprise you that I feel a real affinity for other families of murder victims. It's, what does John Walsh say? You're being invited to join the club that no one wants to be
a part of.
Yeah. And there's a lot of truth to that. And I've met John Walsh several times.
It sounds like, though, you guys have created a bit of family of your own, right?
Yeah, it's hard not to feel a real bond when whether it's the Colonial Parkway murders cases or others. I've met a lot of people through our advocacy work and our Mind Over Murder podcast, where you just feel a real, almost instantaneous bond with this person who's suffered a similar loss. And as you were saying a minute ago, Jason, we all go into our lives, particularly as we move into adulthood, with the understanding that ultimately we will lose, hopefully, first our grandparents, then our parents. But something my mom said all those years ago about losing Cathy at age 27 was, she said in her very, sort of quiet Irish Catholic way, she said, it's out of the natural order of things. And my mom, as usual, was right about that. The news in January 2024 was fantastic news. And when you've been looking for answers for this long, finding out what happened to your daughter, your son, your brother, your sister, that it actually is good news. So even though I don't know if someone that hasn't experienced this can completely understand it, but there's some joy in having answers when you've been looking for this long.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I had Julie Murray on recently.
Yeah, we're big fans of hers.
Yeah, she's a great person. Her sister, Maura, disappeared in New Hampshire. Also, I think was at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where you also went to school. And, one of the things that Julie said to me that was just unbelievably profound, because I think she was hinting at the idea that sometimes people perceive her wanting to suppress, let's say, bad things about Maura's life. And I think one of the points that she made is, I don't care whether it's bad or good, just that it's true.
Yes.
That it helps solve my sister's case. And the idea of, I'm sure part of you never gives up hope in a case like that you'll find your sister, but that idea that you can get answers has real value for people. I'm one of those people who likes to have puzzles solved. I also love mysteries, but I love to have puzzles solved.
Me too.
Yeah. And, but I can only imagine, if the puzzle was as high stakes as what happened to my brother, or my parent, or something like that, like the yearning for answers, I already stay up late at night thinking about puzzles that are much lower stakes. I can only imagine. What was
Yeah.
it like in the beginning of the investigation for you
Well,
all?
we had, it's funny, I was just talking with the other families because we had a meeting down in Virginia last week. And so I saw several of the Colonial Parkway murders families, and we were all talking about how we had such great faith in the FBI, which has been dashed, quite frankly, because they've been incredibly difficult to deal with. And we don't think they've done a good job in this investigation at all. And it, but I think we kind of naively put a lot of faith in the FBI. And if you die inside a national park, like the Colonial Parkway National Park, it's an FBI case from day one. So
Right.
it's not handled by, local or county or state law enforcement. It's handled by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And the truth is, they actually don't do a lot of murders.
Right,
So
right.
it's really
That's one of
outside
the
their sweet spot.
Yeah, that's one of the misconceptions. I was talking to an FBI agent not too long ago where they were saying, you think of the FBI and when you're on TV or watching Criminal Minds, they're constantly running down murder cases. But the reality
Mm-hmm.
is the vast majority of their work is white collar crime, terrorism,
Right.
things like that, that the expertise in the FBI for murders comes from their people who have been local detectives or who have done other
Right.
things along those lines.
That's correct. And but people have been sort of sold a bill of goods by the procedurals that we see on television, which I
Right.
enjoyed. Don't misunderstand me. Kristen Dilley, my podcast partner, is a huge fan of procedurals, um, particularly Criminal Minds. But I think our faith was not well placed. I think we had this perception of the almighty FBI as being good at murders and able to solve cases cleanly and quickly, but that actually is more of what we see on television than the reality.
Right. And so when I imagine in the beginning, though, law enforcement in a case like this probably wants to find out as much as they can about your sister and about Becky. Did they involve you all early in the investigation, keep you informed? What was that like?
Well, my father in particular, he was our spokesperson, and he was in touch with the FBI agents quite regularly. And as a matter of fact, of all the members of the family, I took the greatest interest in what the status of the investigation was. So I
Okay.
would talk to my dad from my office, and he'd be in his office.
Mhm.
Or if I was at home visiting with my folks, my dad and I would take a drive somewhere or find a quiet corner because the rest of the family found this way too upsetting to talk about. And I wanted to know what was going on and what kind of progress they were making. And my dad, we knew those FBI agents by name. Their names came up at the dinner table when we were home visiting with my folks. But in terms of detail, my dad knew a lot about what was going on. It wasn't until 2009 when the story broke about the leaked crime scene photos after the FBI lost control of these graphic
And
photos.
isn't the story there that I think there was a leak of some of the photos and a bit of a manhunt? I remember, I think local police eventually figured it out, but a manhunt to figure out how these pictures from the crime scenes, is that right, ended up in the public?
Yeah, and it turns out that an FBI non-agent, they made a real big deal about this, that he was not an agent, but he was an FBI photographer, and he had
Mm.
stolen a copy of the photographs, and he had retired from the FBI as a photographer, and then he was teaching evening classes at an academy that taught security guards and private investigators. And he was using these highly graphic crime scene photos in his evening classes. And so that's how the FBI found out. A local retired deputy sheriff, Fred Atwell, had approached the FBI. And there may have actually been a blackmail attempt in there too, because this story gets there's so many twists and turns in the Colonial Parkway murders. It's sometimes hard to say, where do we start? But it ultimately came out that the FBI had lost control of these photos through this theft by an FBI employee.
How did you find out about it? Did you in the media, or did the FBI reach out? Or
no, heaven forbid the FBI would ever reach out and admit a mistake. That's not the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The way this came about in September 2009, I was at work in Los Angeles. I was the executive director for AFTRA, the Performers Union, which is later merged with the Screen Actors Guild. And it was a few weeks before the anniversary. And I found myself kind of thinking about Cathy and Becky. And I don't know exactly what happened, but it got to be late, like around 7:00 or so. And I was the boss. And so people said goodnight and they went on their way. And they were on my mind. And so I'm not exactly sure what possessed me here, but I just turned to my computer and kind of looked out, and the Hollywood sign is in the distance all lit up, and thinking about the fact that, it's going to be the 23rd anniversary of their death. And I just typed into Google Colonial Parkway murders, and dozens of articles came up. And I'm not exactly sure why I did this, but I started reading every single article, whether I'd read it before or not. And there were news stories from television, particularly Virginia media. And I read each story or watched each story, and I just kept clicking. And so from 7 p.m. till midnight that night, I just sat there. I just sat there and I read or watched every single story, whether I'd read it before or not. And so somewhere over the course of that evening, I got to a story which I had never seen before. And it was on the YouTube platform. And it was a local news story, very well done, by a reporter named Mike Mather. And he was reporting about the crime scene photos getting out into the public from the Colonial Parkway murders. And I was outraged. And I'm thinking to myself, why don't I know about this? Why doesn't my father know about this? He was still alive at this point. And so I watched a very long, very professional news story. And I had worked representing broadcasters. The story was probably close to 5 minutes long, which is a lot of time on a local newscast. And it was all about these crime scene photos getting out. And I remember thinking how odd and infuriating this was. And then what I couldn't tell was, when did this happen? Because, the YouTube platform tells you when something was put up. It doesn't tell you when it was created. So if you're watching a news story, I couldn't tell whether this had happened, the previous week or 5 years before. So I then made my way to the website for the television station, which is WTKR, the CBS affiliate down in Norfolk, Virginia.
Is this Mike Mather, who used to be at the Virginian Pilot?
The very same.
Yeah,
A wonderful guy.
Unbelievable police reporter. Yeah.
A wonderful reporter. And he'd met his wife when they were both working as reporters. And Mike and I stay in touch. So I went to the WTKR website because I wanted to see, when was this story created? And then I realized this story happened only a few weeks prior to me seeing it that night in Los Angeles. Then I saw there was a second story. And in the second story, which was also very lengthy. Mike was clearly giving the FBI office in Norfolk a chance to wipe some of the egg off their face about the leak of the crime scene photos. And they were making all kinds of commitments about putting new resources into the Colonial Parkway murders case. And it was very clear it was a give and get. It was as you know, as someone who's worked in media, sometimes in order to get a story, you have to give them something. And that had clearly happened in this regard. I also didn't think that Brian Hanlon, the FBI special agent in charge, he was the assistant special agent in charge. He was speaking on camera, which I know is unusual for the FBI because they only want to talk about good news. They never want to talk about bad news, and they sure as hell don't want to appear on camera. And yet in the second story there, he was back and he was putting a much more positive spin on the story. And I'll be frank, as always, Jason, when I watched the first story, remember, I've represented broadcasters. I've been around broadcasting, film and television, et cetera, for decades. I actually didn't think he was being truthful. He looked evasive, and he looked honestly like someone had a gun off camera and was holding the gun on him saying, talk. That's how uncomfortable he looked.
I'm guessing it was probably the FBI Public Affairs Office holding the gun to the back of his head or someone.
Yeah, and he was the guy in charge when the leak happened.
Right.
So he ended up, having to take the heat. So that same night then, as I continued this journey through all of these stories, I came upon a Facebook page, and I'd never seen this before, and it had a very unusual title. It said, "Whatever Happened to Richard Keith Call and Cassandra Haley?" ? And it was a Facebook page created by the families of the Call and Haley families, who were considered one of the Colonial Parkway murders, even though technically it's a disappearance because their bodies were never found. But they had this very...
Are they the ones that they suspect may have actually ended up in the water, or that's...
Yes, okay. the very same. But the families had created this Facebook page, and it was fascinating. They would put up stories and notices about rallies and vigils, and they were doing a lot of things in that peninsula area of Virginia near Williamsburg. They were doing a lot of things, and then they were getting a lot of support from the community. And one of the reasons for the odd title is that Facebook wouldn't let you, at that time, use the word murder in the name of a Facebook page, which is why it didn't say anything about murder or Colonial Parkway murders or anything like that. So at this point now, my family has never had any contact whatsoever with the other Colonial Parkway murders families, not even the Dowski family. Because remember, when Cathy died, we hadn't even met Becky. So we actually, it's beyond awkward. We didn't know what to say to the Dowski family. So we'd never spoken to them.
Not knowing what to say.
Well, my sister and Becky Dowski died together. They were in a relationship together, but it was early stages. We hadn't ever met her. So we had no relationship with Becky and no relationship with the Dowski family. And we'd never had any contact. We'd followed a bit about what was going on with the Colonial Parkway murders, which is what the case came to be called. And so that same evening, I made a decision to reach out to the Call family, who were clearly the administrators of this page. And I wrote for the first time that night a message that I've written hundreds of times since, which started off, "My name is Bill Thomas. I'm the older brother of Cathy Thomas, who together with her girlfriend, Rebecca Dowski, were the first two victims in the Colonial Parkway murders. And, you can tell from the way I said it. I've written this so many times. I've memorized it. And so I wasn't sure what the Call and Haley families were going to say. They're hearing from me for the first time ever. And I didn't know whether they were going to tell me to go pound sand or what, or where you been for the last 23 years. Bill Thomas, we don't know who you are. And I found out later that they saw the message, and immediately Chris Call, who is Keith's brother, reached out to his sister Joyce Call, Canada, that's her married name. And he said, "Did you see the message on the page?" And she looked at it, and Chris said, "I think we should talk to this guy. He's, this is Cathy's brother." Now, they've never heard from us and never spoken to us, but I heard from them almost immediately. And then we actually had a 3-way conference call that weekend. And one of the things I said to Joyce and Chris was, I think we could leverage the embarrassment of the FBI to force, that's the word I used, force, to force them to put resources back into the Colonial Parkway murders. And they had done a lot of great work in the case, and they were completely on board. And they said, that's a great idea.
So that's actually how, so it was tripping across that story about the FBI and the pictures, got you interested in it again, which then led you to the other family members. So that group of family members really didn't crystallize until 2009. So what happened when you guys put your heads together?
Well, they were extremely smart and very, very knowledgeable about the cases, and they had been kind of driving a family campaign to build awareness of the Colonial Parkway murders and to keep putting the name out there so that people would know that the case had not been solved and that it still needed, as we like to say, time, attention, and resources. And then I came in and I had this communications background and had done, media and public affairs and legislative affairs and, all that kind of stuff. So I had a skill set that I think was helpful to them. I don't want to imply that nothing was happening before I got involved. Far from it. They had done lots of great work. They had testified before the Virginia State House, and they'd had, as I mentioned, rallies and candlelight vigils, and they'd raised funds for private investigators, and they'd done a lot of great work. I just came along later and said, we could really amp up the pressure on the FBI and the Virginia State Police. That's one thing that's worth talking about, too. 2 of the cases in the Colonial Parkway murders happened inside the national park, and they're FBI cases, as we talked about. 2 of the double homicides happened outside the Colonial National Park, and they became Virginia State Police cases, which is actually one of the reasons why we believe this case has gone unsolved for so long, is that whether law enforcement likes it or not, back in the 1980s, the FBI and the Virginia State Police did not work well together. And
I was talking to someone recently from the FBI who was saying to me, a former FBI person who was saying to me, and do you think the myth of us working well together now is reality?
Well, yeah. I'd like to think it's a little better. I
hope
your listeners can hear me rolling my eyes over the podcast. Well, I think
I think one of the interesting things too about the case that, it complicates it. You've got Colonial Parkway, which is run by the National Park Service, and like you said, some of the victims were found on Colonial Parkway, a territory that was run by the National Park Service, some within Virginia, and the Virginia State Police took the lead on those cases. But even just one of the wild things to me is just the geography down there, because I think most people are used to, I think a lot of people have taken the trip from sort of the Richmond area down to Williamsburg on 64. And, it's filled with trees, resorts, naval bases,
Yep.
and CIA's Camp Perry.
Right. Military facilities all
Is
over the
all over.
place.
Yeah, and it's an interesting. So it's they call it the Virginia Peninsula, but most people call it the Lower Peninsula. And
Right.
then there's the Middle Peninsula of Virginia, which is just north of there, above the York River, and then above the Rappahannock, you have the Northern Neck, which is where my mom came from. Very different yet similar places. But
Mm-hmm.
there were so many things that were surprising to me about the announcement about Wilmer, and one of them for me was that he wasn't from the Lower Peninsula, that he actually
Correct.
came from the Northern Neck and Lancaster, and my mother's family, literally, like 15 minutes away. They were in Heathsville and
Oh,
Edwardsville.
yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so truly, really close. I remember, I remember telling one of my cousins about it, and he was like, "There was a white person living on this side of the river."
I think I'm not an expert on all things Northern Neck, but I think so.
Well, apparently there was. There are plenty of white people there, but it's not exactly beside. You've got to cross rivers, and but then I read the article, and I read, because my grandfather was a fisherman on the Northern Neck,
Oh,
and
yeah.
as
See?
soon as I heard he was a fisherman, I was like, this makes sense. Because I remember my grandfather's stories of going to Delmarva, the Middle
Mm-hmm.
Peninsula, lower, and even up to Staten Island to bring fish.
Right.
But then I read a few days after that Wilmer's name had been in the case file for years.
Well, and okay, that's worth talking about, Jason, because when they made the announcement on January 8th, they did not mention, and as a matter of fact, they were asked twice about it by a local television reporter, Andy Fox. He asked twice in the press conference, can you say when Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. first moved onto your radar? And a Virginia State Police spokeswoman was answering the questions, and she said no. She literally said no twice.
No, she won't answer the question.
No, she won't answer the question. And of course, those of us that know the case well went berserk because we said Wilmer was suspect number one in the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley in 1988. So the reason why that came out a few days later is because some of the reporters and myself and author Blaine Pardo, who together with his daughter Victoria Hester had written a very good book on the Colonial Parkway murders, we kicked up a fuss in the media because we said, why is the FBI and the Virginia State Police failing to connect the dots here? And we knew for a fact that Wilmer was a suspect in the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley, and they didn't want to talk about it because the FBI had Wilmer in custody in 1988. He had moved on to FBI radar 4 days, literally 4 days after Keith Call and Cassandra Haley went missing. They did a full.
What put him on the radar?
Well, he drove a very, very distinctive truck. And so while the FBI was throwing resources, and I mean that in a complimentary way, at this murder, this disappearance and presumed murder, they started talking to couples who were on the Colonial Parkway, which is a very isolated, extremely dark place, this 23 mile long ribbon of land that was known as a big makeout place because it had complete privacy, no lights, no traffic lights. It's pitch black out there. So if couples wanted to be alone, they would go to these little pull-offs along the Colonial Parkway. Well, stories started emerging almost immediately after the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley, which at this point is incident number 3 in the Colonial Parkway murders. These couples said they were harassed by a guy who drove an extremely distinctive truck. He was
Hmm.
driving a blue-green pickup truck with writing on the door and a very large, elaborate rig on the back of the truck, which kind of looks like a tow truck mechanism, but was actually designed for hauling crab pots and oyster pots
Yep.
out of the water. So this guy's driving this very distinctive truck. It was a 1966 Dodge Dakota pickup truck, faded blue green. It was a one of one kind of truck. So they knew they were looking for that truck. So interestingly, one of the radio operators had helped them set up a command post on the Colonial Parkway, because at this point now they've had 2 double homicides, Thomas Dowski and Robin Edwards and David Knobling. So that
This is a police radio operator? Or?
This was the FBI.
Oh, FBI.
So this guy was and he handled, and remember, this is before the internet, before cell phones, and so they were very dependent on their radios to communicate where the agents were, who they were interviewing, where they were going, and they were doing a full court press. They actually bought every room in a motel that was down there off the Colonial Parkway, and that was their headquarters. And they were really, and like I said, I mean this in a complimentary way, they were throwing resources. They realized at this point, and this is the 3rd incident now in this, what has clearly become a series, this young couple has disappeared. We got a problem. We think we have a serial killer on our hands. So they're working this thing hard. This radio operator, he's responsible for setting up all the communications. He's actually driving, and he is aware of the fact that the agents, because he's heard the chatter, they're looking for this very distinctive truck. And he radios in himself. This guy's not an agent. And he says, guys, I'm on, I think it was 64, Interstate 64. I'm on the highway and I'm next to the truck you guys are looking for. And to make things even more distinctive, he then gives them a license plate, EM Raw, Edam Raw. It's a obviously off color oyster
reference, right?
Yeah. So he gives them the license plate. So 4 days after Keith Call and Cassandra Haley go missing, 2 FBI agents roll up on him at his house up on the Northern Neck, and he's behaving very strangely. He is cleaning out the truck with some sort of very powerful solvent and repainting the parts of the interior of this ancient truck. And they thought it was very, very suspicious. They questioned him in the driveway. They went back and got a search warrant, and they went back and served a search warrant. They searched his truck. They searched his home. They found guns, knives, an extensive collection of pornography. They were absolutely certain they had the right guy. So he's suspect number 1 in the Call Haley disappearance. They then brought him in and they gave him 2 polygraph examinations. He passed one, and the second one was inconsistent, that is, inconclusive. And
that's interesting there, that they would give him a polygraph, he would pass it, and then they would want to give him another. Because usually it's the other way around, right? Like
right.
You are inconclusive, then they give you another one. So they must have been really sure of themselves.
I think we all forget these, as I said a moment ago, these are not fictional stories. These are real stories of real people who've been lost to us. And I think there are ways to present them, their stories, in ways that are respectful. And I can think of a number of examples, podcasts included, that have crossed the line, and we don't need to hear that. One other area that I'm personally very uncomfortable with, as you and I were talking a little bit offline, I love to laugh. And I hope I am able to convey to your listeners that I also consider myself a joyful person. and I have lots of great things in my life. I've been very lucky. I'm not terribly comfortable with the blending. It's a small category, but I'm not comfortable with blending comedy and descriptions of real life cases.
Yeah, it's one thing
It
to have levity and laugh at humorous moments, but it's another
Yes.
thing to make it a joke.
Well, and Kristen and I do try to include some lighthearted moments. We make fun of ourselves, and if something funny comes up, we'll laugh. I actually think that's important that people hear us laugh, because
Yeah.
I don't want people who've never met me and might never, our paths might never cross. I don't want them to be thinking that I'm this, gloom and doom person, and that my life has been destroyed by losing our younger sister. That's not the case. Is it important to me? Of course. But there are still lots of wonderful moments in the rest of my life. And if something funny happens on Mind Over Murder, we'll laugh. And I think that's okay. But I'm not here to make fun of people. And I'm certainly not here to make jokes in between doing a Wikipedia rip and read about a
At the
case.
expense of anyone involved in it, because ultimately any murder is a tragedy. Like I look at cases like the Delphi murders, which are the trials going on right now, and it's a tragedy for everyone. You look at the BTK case, which is the bind, torture, kill Dennis Rader one in Kansas, his serial killings, and we tend to think of the victims themselves as victims. There are all these secondary victims,
Right,
that people like the loved ones, and you even have tertiary victims like communities and
mm-hmm.
or even perpetrators' families. I mean, there are so many people who are hurt by this, and I always like to think or hope that I treat these kinds of things like it was, or I have a filter at the end that says to me, how would I feel about this if this were my family member?
Exactly. I liken that ripple effect of the collateral damage to when we were kids. We would drop a stone into a pond or something, and you'd watch the ripple, the rings go out across the water. The closer you are to the center where the pebble dropped into the water, that loss is going to, I think, have the greatest amount of impact. The waves from the rock are going to be larger, closer to the center. But the ripple effect reaches in ways that are truly far-reaching. And you're right. The community as a whole suffers when we have unsolved rapes and murders, for example. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that especially the people that are closest to the victims and the center of that ripple effect, they need to be considered. And this is where, people like Julie Murray, who we think the world of, she's so articulate and so smart and so thoughtful. And she's going through many of the same emotions, I would think, that I am, and that hundreds of thousands of other people across the country are going through in dealing with these kind of losses.
Yeah, 300,000 people. That's a lot of victims' family members. That's a lot of loved ones and other capacities. And I like that. I like that metaphor about the ripple effect that happens. And I kind of thinking about it, like so many of you guys, to use another water metaphor, it's like you're drowning or trying to tread water. Am I going to throw a life raft to you, or am I going to throw more water on you, or maybe like throw a rock at you? there's no
Mm-hmm.
reason to create additional suffering because you can still tell stories and help people learn from them and help have a positive impact without throwing a rock at somebody who's already suffering or struggling to swim. I was curious, what is it that you hope for in terms of the next steps of the case, and also hope for this sort of, the relationship between victims' families and law enforcement and the media landscape? If you could, like, wave your magic wand or have your dream come true, what would it be?
Well, I mean, I'd love to see answers in the Colonial Parkway murders, of course. And we actually think we may be getting closer. This identification of Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. As a suspect. And by the way, I keep saying senior because very sad, he has a son whose name is Alan Wade Wilmer Jr. And so, this poor guy, unless he changes his name, is going through life as a victim as well. He has literally the exact same name as his father. I'd like to see answers in the Colonial Parkway murders. Notice I didn't say justice or closure or any of those things. And I'd like to see the opportunity for an improved level of communication between law enforcement and the families of victims. I think that's something we really need to redouble our efforts to find a way to communicate more clearly and, dare I say, empathically with families of murder victims.
What do you think it is? Do you think it's the politics of law enforcement, or that you just become desensitized after, you know, having to deal with so much crime? What is it that creates the barrier?
I think that's a lot of it. I also think institutions tend to put institutional interests ahead of everything else, which is very unfortunate. And I think there's always a concern that if they say something to a loudmouth like me or whatever, that's going. I'm going to be back on my podcast talking about it or whatever. I think there's a concern about liability. I also think that there's no question in my mind. I've met a lot of folks in law enforcement that they want to solve cases and they want to serve their communities. But I think there's a lot of pressure on agencies not to look bad or look like they're not doing the job. I mean, I have this idea. I'm not saying it's a fully baked cake or anything, but I have this idea. I believe that we need to put significantly more resources into law enforcement, particularly cold cases. I have this idea. I come from a military family. I hold military folks and law enforcement in very high regard. I think we're spending too much money on the American military, even though I come from a military family. I think, for example, we should set up permanently funded positions, and I'm just making this up. I'd like to see 100,000 people who are currently serving in the U.S. military be offered positions around the country to be able to work those 300,000 cold cases that I talked about, leave the military and join law enforcement with permanent positions. This isn't going to be one of those, whims of Congress kind of thing. We have to be serious about this. I actually think this could be like when I was a kid, John F. Kennedy spoke about us landing on the moon
Moonshot.
in 10 years. Exactly. And we were little kids at the time, but even so, being Kennedy Democrats from Massachusetts, which we were, we found this very inspirational. I would love to see us put a 10-year effort into solving as many of those 300,000 cases as we could, much like the moonshot and other lofty goals, but worthwhile goals. Because if you think about it, you mentioned this a moment ago, the family members of those 300,000 victims, let's just say on average, there's 4 people in each family. That means every single night, over 1 million people are struggling to get to sleep, wondering if their family member's case is ever going to be solved. And by the way, I know people get very process oriented. I'm not expecting all those people to be brought to justice, the bad guys, if you will. We're at 38 years now in the Colonial Parkway murders. We're fully cognizant of the fact that it's quite possible that Alan Wade Wilmer or other suspects may be involved in the Colonial Parkway murders, and they may never see justice per se, but answers are incredibly important. And I've actually tried to convey this to our FBI agents and Virginia State Police investigators, that answers are of great comfort to families who have been seeking answers, in our case, for decades. And so it isn't just a matter of putting bad guys in jail or charging people. It's about telling people what happened. I want to know why someone killed my sister Cathy and her girlfriend Rebecca Dowski in October 1986 on the Colonial Parkway. I'm not expecting people to go to jail at the 38-year mark. That's probably not a realistic goal, but I think answers are a reasonable thing to ask for.
That makes complete sense. Well, Bill, I just wanted to thank you for coming on, and I really enjoyed this conversation. Hopefully I will get the chance to go to CrimeCon in Denver, and you'll be there speaking.
Yes.
Next year in 2025. So, again, I really appreciate it, and I'm hoping for, if it isn't some measure of justice, some measure of answers, and maybe a world where we have a little bit more empathy, and it's a little bit easier for us to put ourselves in the shoes of people like you who have been wounded. I always like to remind myself that the one thing we all have in common as humans is we go through suffering. And if you think about the suffering, the worst moments in your own life, and use that empathy from that to really be there for other people, we're going to have a better world overall. I feel like I'm singing a James Taylor song, like Shuttle but I do believe it.
I do too. And we went to see James Taylor at Tanglewood this summer. So
nice.
I can identify.
My dad and I went to Wolf Trap this summer. So
very cool. Well,
right.
Incredibly well spoken. You might want to wave your amateur card and go professional at this point.
Thanks for joining for this conversation. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/the Silver Linings Handbook. It's only $2 a month, and it goes a long way to support us in bringing you this podcast. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you all again next week.